The dog lay still near the edge of the sidewalk, his ribs visible beneath the patchy fur that hadn't seen a brush or a bath in weeks. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the crumbling concrete, catching the dust that danced in the heat rising from the ground. His breathing was shallow and uneven, the soft rise and fall of his chest barely perceptible. People passed by, some with glances of pity, others with hurried steps avoiding the scene altogether. But the dog, silent and unmoving, didn't seem to notice them. His gaze was fixed in one direction only, on a single house across the street. Despite the noise of the neighborhood, the shouting from the corner store, the cars revving as they weaved through potholes, nothing broke his focus. His eyes, dulled by age and pain, locked onto that house like a compass needle to true north. It was an old house, nothing remarkable. Peeling white paint, an iron gate rusted orange by time, windows closed tight despite the summer heat. No movement inside. No light. But still, the dog stared. From morning to dusk, he hadn't taken his eyes off it. A few children had thrown him scraps earlier, bits of sandwich crust or the remains of a taco, but he didn't move. A boy had even nudged him with his sneaker, half curious if the dog was alive. He didn't react. Only blinked, once, then returned to staring at the same house. His front paw trembled now and then, a small twitch as if his body tried to hold on just a little longer. Across the street, behind the carts of fruit and the buckets of mop water, a girl sat crouched by the store wall. Her name was Lonnie. Just 13, her clothes were too big, her sneakers frayed, and her long dark hair tied back with a shoelace. She wasn't shopping or playing or waiting for anyone. She was working. Her job was to clean whatever needed cleaning. Mornings were mopping the entrance tiles. Afternoons scrubbing the store bathroom. Evenings sweeping the trash that collected outside. She didn't complain. Didn't talk much. But she noticed things. And she had noticed the dog 2 days ago. He hadn't left that spot since. She watched as he refused the water she placed in a cracked bowl beside him. She watched when the sky opened and rain soaked him, and he still didn't budge. But most of all, she noticed his eyes, always locked on that same old house. That evening, after wiping the storefront one last time, she approached the dog again. The street had emptied a little. The fruit seller was packing up. Lonnie knelt beside the animal, her knees pressing into the damp pavement, and looked at him. His eyes still stared across the road. She turned to follow his gaze, and finally really looked at the house. Something about it gave her a strange feeling. Not fear. Not curiosity. Something else. A kind of hush, like the air got heavy when you stood in front of it. She reached out and gently touched the dog's fur. It was coarse, cold in places, warm in others. The dog didn't look at her. He didn't flinch. But a small noise escaped his throat. Not a bark. Not a whimper. Just acknowledgement. She sat beside him, unsure what else to do. For the first time since she noticed him, she stopped rushing. She watched the house. The shutters. The chipped wood. The silence behind the glass. And for nearly half an hour, she said nothing. Neither did he. But they sat together. The streetlight flickered on. A breeze passed through, and the faint scent of dried flowers or maybe dust carried across. Lonnie looked down again at the dog, whose breath now came slower than before. His eyes, still fixed, had begun to water. Or maybe it was the wind. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old towel she kept for drying her hands. She laid it gently over the dog's side, tucking it beneath his belly like a blanket. She had seen enough cold things die alone. This one wouldn't. Then something moved. Just a flicker, in the house. A curtain. A shadow. She wasn't sure. But her heart skipped. She stood and stepped into the street, ignoring a honking horn as a car swerved around her. She reached the gate and pressed her hand against it. The metal was warm. She peered between the bars. Nothing. Just the stillness of an abandoned home. Yet she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. She turned back, and the dog was watching her now. Not the house. Her. Just for a moment. Then his eyes closed. And he exhaled. Lonnie ran back, heart pounding. She dropped to her knees and placed her hand on his chest. It rose. Once. Then stopped. No sound. No twitch. No breath. She felt her eyes sting but blinked it away. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She looked around for something, anything, and that's when she noticed it. Tucked beneath his other paw, damp from the street but folded carefully, was a piece of paper, thin, yellowed, and written on. She slowly pulled it out, unfolding it with care, like it might fall apart. Her eyes scanned the first line, and what she read made her stomach drop. Lonnie remained motionless for a long time, her fingers trembling around the thin edges of the folded paper now in her lap. The weight of the moment settled on her small shoulders, and though the world continued to move around her, cars rushing past, a man yelling into his phone down the block, the buzz of neon lights flickering above the bodega door, she was completely still, locked into the fragile silence that had fallen between her and the lifeless body beside her. The dog's fur, damp from the sidewalk and dusted with the fine grime of the city, clung to the fabric of the towel she'd placed on him, and the stillness of his ribcage only deepened the hollow in her chest. But her eyes, wide and stunned, remained fixed on the words scrawled on the letter, words so unexpected, so deliberate, that they shattered the simplicity of everything she thought she'd understood about the stray who had spent his final days staring at a forgotten house. It wasn't just a note, it was a message, a confession, a truth folded under a dying paw, waiting for the right person to find it. The paper itself was brittle, not fresh, with one corner partially torn and a water stain bleeding through the top edge. The handwriting was shaky but purposeful, written in blue ink that had faded unevenly with time. There were no formal greetings, no names, just a block of raw emotion pressed onto the page like the last breath of someone who had no other way to speak. Lonnie couldn't make sense of all of it at first. Some lines referenced dates, others referenced a woman named Sarah, and at the very bottom, scribbled in uneven script, was a sentence that made her blood run cold. If anyone finds him, please look at the house. The truth is still in there. That line echoed inside her like the toll of a bell after midnight, unsettling, strange, and heavy with meaning she didn't yet understand. She reread it over and over, trying to make sense of what truth could be hidden in a silent house that no one had entered for what seemed like years. As the evening settled into night, the street emptied more. The store closed. The vendors packed their carts and disappeared into alleys and backstreets. The lights inside the windows of the surrounding apartments blinked on one by one, casting warm glows that made the sidewalk feel colder by contrast. Still, Lonnie remained by the dog's side, her fingers occasionally brushing over the note, the towel, the stiffening fur, like she was keeping him company even in his absence. But something had changed in her. She didn't just feel pity anymore, she felt called. Pulled toward something she couldn't name. That house. That gate. That window. It was no longer a backdrop to a dying dog's final hours. It was a piece of a story she was now tangled in, whether she liked it or not. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long on the concrete. She folded the note and placed it carefully in the pocket of her jacket, then looked once more at the dog, who seemed almost peaceful now under the towel, his eyes closed, his head gently resting on the sidewalk as if in sleep. There was a dignity to his posture now that hadn't been there before. Not just an old dog collapsing in the street, but a messenger, a sentinel who had waited, who had chosen his place, and who had left something behind for her alone to find. She stepped into the street, this time with no hesitation, and crossed toward the gate again, the same one she'd approached hours before. The air around it felt heavier now, like stepping into a room where someone had just whispered a secret. She pressed her hands to the iron, then tested the latch. It wasn't locked. It creaked with a long, aching groan as she pushed it open. The yard beyond was overgrown, tall weeds coiling up around broken ceramic tiles and rusted metal fixtures. The grass had swallowed the path. She moved slowly, her sneakers sinking slightly into the soil with each step. The front door loomed ahead, cracked at the hinges, the wood swollen and splintered. A plastic chair lay overturned on the porch, and beneath it, Dried leaves had collected in layers like forgotten pages. She stepped onto the first wooden board of the porch and felt it bow slightly under her weight. Then, another. Then she reached the door and pushed. It gave way with a whine, revealing the darkness inside. She didn't have a flashlight, only the weak beam from her phone, which she held high as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and old dust. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the patterns barely visible beneath streaks of moisture damage and time. An old armchair sat in the corner of what once was a living room, its cushions caved in and stained. On the walls were faded photographs, too dust-covered to identify, but one had fallen onto the floor, its cracked glass frame reflecting her light in jagged fragments. The floor creaked beneath her as she moved further in, careful not to trip over fallen objects or loose boards. Every step felt like descending into a memory that had been sealed off too long. In the back of the house, a door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open and entered what had once been a bedroom. There was no bed anymore, only a mattress on the floor, mold clinging to the edges, and in the corner, an old dog bowl. Empty. Next to it, a leash still attached to the wall. Her breath caught. He had lived here. Or been kept here. She couldn't tell which. But it was his. That much she knew. She reached down and picked up the bowl, inspecting the inside. Scratched. Old. But on the outside, beneath a film of dirt, there was something written in marker. She rubbed at it with her sleeve, revealing a name. Max. The dog had a name. She sank down to the floor, bowl in hand, heart pounding. Her mind reeled. Max had lived here. Waited. Escaped. Been left. There was a story buried beneath these rotting floorboards, and somehow, a young girl who cleaned storefronts for change had been chosen to uncover it. She opened her jacket, pulled out the letter again, and reread it by the beam of her phone. This time, every word hit differently. The names. The dates. The house. Max. The final message. And now, she knew, this was only the beginning. The night deepened as Lonnie remained crouched in the ruined bedroom, the silence of the house pressing against her skin like a heavy, invisible weight. She could hear the wind shifting through the cracks in the old windows, whistling softly like a voice trying to speak from another time. Her eyes were locked on the bowl, her fingers tracing the worn-out letters of the name, Max, over and over again, as if repetition might summon clarity, as if the truth buried beneath the dust of this house could somehow rise to the surface through touch alone. The note she had found on the dog, the one who had spent his last hours staring at this house from across the street, was still unfolded beside her on the floor. Its message, cryptic at first, had begun to settle into something tangible, something real, and the weight of what she was beginning to uncover wrapped around her with the steady pressure of purpose. Max had lived here. Max had waited. And someone had left something behind that he had protected until the very end. The room around her, though still and abandoned, was filled with quiet clues. In one corner, near the window, a small shelf tilted forward on a broken leg, its contents scattered across the floor in dusty piles. There were pill bottles, expired years ago, their faded labels barely legible, and next to them, a crumpled photograph stuck to a piece of glass. Lonnie picked it up gently and wiped away the grime with her sleeve. The image, though weathered by time, showed a man with kind eyes holding a dog in his lap, a golden shepherd with unmistakable markings. Max. The man was sitting on the porch steps of the very same house, a smile stretching across his face like someone who had finally found peace. Lonnie's throat tightened. It wasn't just any stray. Max had belonged to someone who loved him. Someone who had vanished. And now Max was gone too. She stood, her knees aching, and made her way through the narrow hallway back toward the front of the house, the floorboards protesting beneath her with every step. She paused near the front room where she noticed another door slightly ajar, one she hadn't seen before. Inside was what used to be a study. The desk was tilted sideways, one leg cracked, but atop it sat a closed metal box with a tarnished brass latch. It wasn't locked. When she opened it, a stack of letters tumbled out, bound with a piece of string. Most were unopened, some torn, others sealed in blank envelopes. They were all addressed to the same person, Sarah, Her breath caught as she scanned the return address, an assisted living facility just 15 blocks from where she now stood. The postmarks were from over a decade ago, each letter sent from this very house. Whoever lived here had written to someone named Sarah, again and again, without ever receiving a reply. She took the letters and the photo, placing them carefully in her backpack. Then she moved toward the door. As she stepped outside, the cold air shocked her skin, reminding her how long she'd been inside, how deeply she'd sunk into a history not her own. Across the street, Max still lay beneath the towel she'd placed on him. A police car had come and gone earlier, taking a statement from the vendor, but hadn't touched the body. No one had. No one knew the story. No one cared. But she did now. And she couldn't leave him there. She couldn't walk away knowing what she knew, holding what she held. This was no longer about a dying dog on a bench. This was about memory. About dignity. About closing a circle that had been left open for too long. The next morning, with the letters bundled tightly in her coat, Lonnie walked through the city streets with Max's leash wrapped around her wrist and the dog bowl tucked under her arm. She moved with a focus she hadn't felt in months. She had slept barely an hour, curled up on the floor of the house, using her backpack as a pillow, the note and the photograph pressed close to her heart. As the sun rose, she'd gone to a nearby shelter, where the staff allowed her to return to the sidewalk and bury Max in the patch of earth behind their building. They didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. She wrapped his body in a blanket she found in the house and placed the dog bowl on top of his grave, then stood for a long time, hands in her pockets, until she could breathe without crying. Only then did she take the next step. The assisted living home stood on a quiet street, behind a metal gate and rows of tall oak trees. The receptionist didn't seem surprised to see her, and when Lonnie asked about Sarah, the woman at the desk hesitated, then walked away without a word. Minutes later, an older woman in a gray cardigan appeared at the far end of the hallway, walking slowly with the aid of a cane. Her face was lined but strong, and her eyes, though tired, sparked with the trace of something that hadn't faded completely. The moment she looked at the photograph in Lonnie's hand, her lips parted in a silent breath. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the picture, holding it like it might dissolve if she blinked too hard. Then she turned and nodded toward a room down the hall. Inside, the walls were bare except for a small calendar and a shelf with books. There was no television, no distractions, only a worn chair by the window and a blanket folded neatly on the bed. Lonnie handed her the letters next, and Sarah sank slowly into the chair, pressing the bundle to her chest. Her expression crumpled as she whispered thanks, not in words, but in the movement of her body, in the way her shoulders dropped, in the tears that fell quietly as she held the final pieces of someone she had lost. She motioned to the bowl and the leash, and Lonnie set them gently on the table. For the first time in a long while, silence felt holy. What Lonnie didn't yet know, what she would later discover through fragments of stories and scattered memories, was that Sarah had been forced to leave her husband when he fell into dementia. That Max had stayed with him through every spiral, every forgotten name, every long hour pacing the porch. That the man had kept writing, even when Sarah's letters stopped reaching him. That Max had remained even after the man passed, waiting in the house, slipping between neighbors, surviving until instinct led him to the only place that had ever felt like a home. A place where he could lie down and face the last chapter, hoping someone would see him. And someone had. The weight of what had just transpired inside that quiet assisted living room lingered with Lonnie like a soft but unshakable pressure against her chest. As she stepped back out into the street, her body moved forward while her mind remained behind, drifting in the fragile silence that had filled Sarah's room. That silence hadn't been empty. It had been full. Full of years lost to misunderstanding. Full of pain tucked into corners that no one ever swept clean. Full of letters that never arrived. Of a dog who never gave up on a home that had dissolved into memory. And Lonnie, who had once felt so displaced in the city, now carried that memory forward like a relic carved into the shape of purpose. Her steps were slower now, not because of fatigue, but because everything seemed heavier. Every building, every car, every passing face, each one a possible fragment in someone's invisible story, someone's Max, someone's loss waiting to be found. She had stumbled into this moment through accident and instinct, But now there was no accident in her movements. There was only resolve. That evening, she didn't return to the shelter she normally visited for dinner or warmth. Instead, she returned to the house. Max's house. The broken one across from the bench where his eyes had last fixed on something that only he understood. She knew she wouldn't sleep, and she didn't want to. Her body ached from walking, her hands were numb from cold, but her thoughts were alive, churning, rewriting pieces of a narrative that had somehow become hers to carry. She unlocked the same side door she had entered through before and stepped back into the time capsule that had once been a home. The walls greeted her like old bones, brittle and quiet, holding on to the past with trembling fingers. She lit the small flashlight she carried in her coat and made her way again to the study, where she had left some of the opened letters and the metal box still resting atop the broken desk. She sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her back resting against the chipped wall. Outside, the streetlights cast faint orange shadows through the dirty windowpanes. Inside, the letters spoke. One by one, she read through the words penned in the careful cursive of a man who had been losing his memory but clinging to his heart. Each page was a mixture of longing and confusion, sometimes repeating names, sometimes drifting off mid-thought, but always returning to one central theme: love that endured. He had written to Sarah every week, even after forgetting what day it was, even after forgetting the names of objects around the house, even after forgetting whether she would ever read what he wrote. Max had watched over him during those hours, had sat beside his chair, had nudged his legs when he forgot to eat, had guarded the door each time he wandered outside in his slippers, unsure of why he had risen. When the man finally passed, alone, likely days before anyone knew, Max had remained. Not just in the physical sense, but spiritually. He had stayed as the last protector of a home that had no one left to guard it. And then, he had waited. And when time drained what little strength was left in his aged body, he crossed the street and stared back at the place where it all began, as if ensuring that someone, anyone, would take notice. Someone did. Lonnie rose from the floor slowly and explored more of the house. In the kitchen, mold had overtaken the cupboards, and rust lined the sink. A cracked plate still sat on the table, beside an overturned mug. There were signs that Max had scavenged what little food remained after the man's passing. His paw prints, barely visible, were still etched faintly in the dust near the back door. She found a worn collar hanging from a nail, one with a faded tag that matched the message she had found tucked under his. It confirmed what she had begun to understand. Max had worn that tag until it broke, and when it did, someone, perhaps a kind soul or maybe the man himself, had written his name and address on a piece of parchment and tucked it inside the newer collar as a safeguard, never imagining that one day it would serve as the only thread between past and present. Lonnie took the collar in her hands, holding it as gently as she had held Max's head on that final morning. There was a nobility in its frayed edges, a testimony to loyalty few humans ever mastered. Later that night, she brought candles into the house. She lit 3 and placed them in different rooms: the bedroom, the study, the front living area, creating soft halos that made the broken house feel almost sacred. Not in the religious sense, but in the way forgotten things become holy when they are finally remembered. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and sat near the front window, watching the bench where she had found Max. The wind rattled the window once, then stilled. For the first time in weeks, Lonnie didn't feel like a ghost wandering someone else's city. She felt like a keeper, a custodian of something that mattered. And even though her own life was still held together with fragile thread, she knew that she had become part of something whole. At dawn, she stepped outside with the collar and returned to the patch of earth where Max had been buried behind the shelter. The frost was thick on the ground, but the air was clear. She knelt beside the small mound and pressed the collar into the dirt, whispering nothing, not because there were no words to say, but because some moments required silence. She stood and turned to leave, but paused when she saw a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, walking a small beagle down the street with his father. The dog paused near Max's grave and sniffed at the earth, tail wagging once before continuing on. Lonnie watched them disappear down the block, her heart aching with something tender and unspoken. The city roared to life around her, cars, voices, sirens, but for the first time, none of it felt like noise. It felt like presence. She made her way to the community center, where she spent most mornings helping sort food donations, and handed them a copy of Max's story written out in her journal. She didn't explain it fully. She didn't need to. They placed it on a small corkboard near the entrance, with a photo of Max attached to the side. People walked past it without noticing, but Lonnie didn't mind. The story wasn't for the world. It was for those who chose to look. For those who, like her, once walked past benches and dogs and houses without ever stopping to see. She had stopped. And now, everything had changed. Days turned to weeks, and the rhythm of Lonnie's life shifted around the silent echo that Max had left behind. The house across from the bench remained untouched, still vacant, still collapsing in its corners, but something had changed within its walls. It had been seen. Witnessed. It was no longer just a shell rotting on a forgotten street. Now it was a resting place, a testimony, a monument to memory and presence. And Max, though his body no longer occupied the cracked sidewalks or the bench where it all began, lived on in quiet, powerful ways. Lonnie began to notice it more each day, the subtle imprint of what he had set in motion. The way strangers walked past that bench a little slower. The way a local boy began placing a biscuit on the stone ledge every morning before school. The way an elderly woman, once silent in her routines, now brought a thermos of soup to the shelter every Friday, insisting it be shared only with those who had dogs. Lonnie herself changed too, though not all at once. Her nights were still cold, her shoes still worn through, and her hunger still present more often than not, but she no longer moved through the city as a shadow. She began volunteering more consistently at the community center, organizing supplies, walking other rescued dogs, and sometimes just sitting beside the elderly during their long quiet afternoons. People who once looked past her began to nod in acknowledgement. Names she'd never known before slowly became familiar. She had been invisible, but Max had drawn the light back to her. He had marked a path for her by marking his own. And the city, in its chaotic, brutal, indifferent sprawl, had shown her a soft underside. Not because it had changed, but because she had. In a way that only time reveals, the impact of one dying dog rippled through lives far beyond that moment on the bench. A local high school teacher who'd read Max's story at the community board included it in an assignment about empathy. A city council member quietly arranged for the old house to be acquired by a local nonprofit to serve as a memorial pet rescue outpost. Volunteers painted over the mildew, repaired the roof, cleared the overgrowth. They left the front door in its original battered condition as a tribute. On a plaque by the entryway, they engraved the words found in Max's final letter: "He never left. He only waited." Lonnie attended the reopening ceremony quietly, standing in the back beneath a tree, her hair pulled back, her coat freshly washed. No one knew who she was in relation to the story, but a few people nodded at her anyway, as if they somehow sensed she belonged there. And she did. She continued to visit the bench often. Sometimes she brought fresh flowers, sometimes just breadcrumbs for pigeons, but mostly she brought herself, and the unwavering silence that had grown to feel like company. Each time she sat there, she stared at the house too. Not in mourning, but in recognition. Because what had unfolded between her and Max was not just a moment of compassion, it had been a collision of fates, the crossing of two forgotten lives who managed, by grace or coincidence, to rescue each other. She didn't speak of him much. She didn't need to. His story lived in her movements now, in the way she knelt gently beside each new animal brought to the shelter, in the way she lingered longer with the lonely, in the way she looked back before leaving any room, just to be sure nothing important was left behind. In the spring, a small event was held in Max's honor. Just a dozen people at most, mostly from the shelter and the center, along with one man from the city's pet outreach program. They lit candles and read a few words, and someone played a soft melody on a weathered violin. Lonnie watched from the edge of the gathering, her eyes dry but bright. As the ceremony ended, a young girl, no older than 7, stepped toward her and offered a folded piece of paper. Inside was a drawing, a brown dog on a bench, a girl kneeling beside him, and a glowing house across the street. The crayon lines were crude, but the emotion was unmistakable. Lonnie kept that drawing folded in her coat pocket for weeks, then placed it inside the metal box in Max's old study when she returned to the house alone one final time. That day, the light poured through the window in a way she hadn't seen before. Sharp, clean, almost golden. Dust danced like memory in the beams, and the smell of the old house seemed lighter, somehow. She didn't stay long. She didn't need to. She closed the door gently and didn't look back. Outside, the city roared forward, uncaring and unstoppable. But she no longer feared it. Because now, she knew what it meant to stop and see. To sit on a bench and watch until the truth revealed itself. Max had taught her that. Not through instruction, but through presence. Through stillness. Through faith. She walked away from the house with a different posture. Her shoulders back, her steps steady. She had no wealth, no home of her own, and few possessions beyond what fit in her worn canvas bag, but she carried something most didn't. A story that mattered. A bond formed not by blood, but by gaze. She had followed Max's eyes, and in doing so, had found her own path. And as she turned the corner, blending once again into the restless rhythm of the city, she knew that somewhere, somehow, another bench waited. Another gaze. Another truth waiting to be seen. And if this story moved you in any way, if you felt something while hearing what this old dog did, and what this young girl discovered, don't let it end here. Help us keep these stories alive, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who might need to see it, and remember, sometimes the quietest moments are the ones that change everything.